All right, welcome everybody to a lecture video for philosophy of law and justice on Robert Paul Wolff's short book entitled In Defense of Anarchism. So in this video, at the top of the video, I'll tell you about what the video will be consisting of and how I will explain things, and I'll try to sum that up for you at the end. So if you have the text handy, open to the table of contents, and you'll see that this book is nicely sectioned into three different parts. The first is called The Conflict Between Authority and Autonomy. The second, The Solution of Classical Democracy. And the third, Beyond the Legitimate State. So, we'll go over mainly the first and second part, since the third part is really just a few pages. So, thus far in Philosophy of Law and Justice, we've gone over Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We read Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and then The Social Contract. And then we skipped from Enlightenment era political philosophy to contemporary political philosophy with John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, or Justice as Fairness. So now we're kind of going back to some of the questions that Rousseau was looking at. Remember that the fundamental question of the social contract was, in creating society, we're going to create this new power, this new structure, the government, or what Rousseau calls the sovereign. And the sovereign is going to have the ability to pass laws under which we all live. So remember that his first question was, his central question, what makes that authority, the authority of the sovereign, the authority of the government, a legitimate authority? And recall that he wondered if there was anything in nature that would justify or ground that political authority. He determined that there wasn't. He said, really, the only thing that can ground that political authority is not anything in nature, but rather something by convention, and that particular convention is the social contract. So, Wolff is also interested in this question of political authority and what legitimates it. And in this book, he's contrasting authority, which we can think of a collective power of the government, with autonomy, which is a capacity that all individual citizens have. So the authority is coming from the collective that is the government, but the risk or concern is that it can limit our personal individual autonomy, or what we want and choose. So remember that for Rousseau, what creates legitimate political power is the social contract. And the fundamental underlying idea to the social contract is the idea that everybody that decides to join society gives consent to the social contract. And that idea was that you agree to become a citizen and to live under the law and to participate in the governmental structure that seeks to aim toward the common good, the good that is in everybody's best interest, but that the common good is determined by the general will, in other words, the way that people vote. So, as we talked about, there could be a law that's up for vote, and let's say 75% of the citizens want it and 25% don't. And so the question that Wolff is concerned with is, for the 25% of people who voted against a law, but because of majority rule democracy have to follow the law because that's the way the majority voted, that is the general will, then aren't the people who voted in the 25% minority, aren't they having their autonomy thwarted or blocked or restricted? They're being compelled by force of law to do something that they didn't choose and don't want to do. So that's the fundamental conflict that he's looking at in this book. The tension between collective political authority and individual autonomy. And remember that, going back to Rousseau, Rousseau said in The State of Nature, there actually is freedom and there is equality. And he made sure to qualify what he meant by natural freedom and natural equality. I'm not going to rehash those now. But also, he said that in moving from the state of nature to the state of civil society, and in moving from natural equality and natural freedom to civil equality and civil freedom, what we hope to do is live under the law when we go from the natural condition to the civil condition, but the aim is that we want to remain as free as we were before in the state of nature. So the question that Wolff is looking at is, how can we remain as free as we were before if we could do whatever we autonomously wanted in the state of nature, but in certain situations in the civil society, we cannot just do what we want in cases in which we are in the minority position. So the people that are in the minority position, aren't they being coerced and compelled to do something that they don't want to do? It seems like they are. So the question is, how can you have, how can you retain political authority of the collective on the one hand? How can you have that and at the same time retain individual autonomy? I mean, maybe you can only have one or the other. Maybe you can have political authority, but you have to sacrifice autonomy. Or maybe there is no such thing as legitimate political authority, and all you have is individual autonomy. Okay? So that's kind of the overview for the entire book, which is only like 80 pages. So if we open up to the first chapter, the conflict between authority and autonomy, it begins with a section called the concept of authority. And in a lot of these early sections, Wolff is laying out a number of important distinctions that we ought to pay attention to. So the first thing he says is that, sort of a review for us, having read Rousseau, he says that the power, the authority that we're creating when we create the government, we can call that political authority, supreme authority on page 4. He reminds us that Rousseau called it sovereignty. But he defines it on page 4, first full paragraph. Authority is the right to command and correlatively the right to be obeyed. Whereas, a distinction, power, on the other hand, is the ability to compel compliance either through the use of threat or force. So here's a key distinction between authority and power. With power, if I'm the bigger person, the stronger person, I can make you do something, let's say. I can make you pick some apples for me by threatening to punch you in the face if you don't do it, or by physically moving you and moving your arms like a puppet and make you do it. So that's power. I can certainly compel a person to do that. But we wouldn't say that anyone that has the power to make you pick apples has the authority to make you pick apples. Having the authority to make you pick apples would mean that they have the justified power to tell you to do something, and they are on justified grounds in being able to legitimately tell you to do something, and at the same time, because they're on legitimate grounds, that compels an obligation from you. So you would be wrong if you didn't pick the apples if you were told to do so by someone who had proper authority over you. So authority and power is the first distinction that we'll go over, that we just went over. Another important distinction that he brings up is the distinction between a de facto state and a de jure state. So this is on page 10 and 11. So de facto, as you can tell by the phrase, means sort of by the fact that. De jure, which means of the day, like maybe you've heard it, what's the soup de jour, the soup of the day, that means more like a state that is official. So if you had a group of people living together but never really articulated a social contract, you could sort of call them a de facto state, but they don't really have a constitution and they didn't really determine what the laws are or anything like that. On the other hand, if we were to actually form a society and legitimate it through our constitution and express laws and procedures of how we would be ruled, that would be a state de jure. And so he drops that distinction in order to say that either kind of state, de facto or de jure, could have authority, but it's really only the de jure state that's going to have any hope to have any kind of legitimate authority. All right, so that's what authority is, the justified power of the sovereign to legitimately pass certain laws that generate obligation to obey those laws from citizens. The second section is the concept of autonomy. So autonomy is a long kind of running philosophical concept. Political autonomy is simply liberty, freedom. So what we're not talking about is metaphysical freedom, or what we call free will. We're simply saying, what are we allowed to do in society? What kind of express freedoms do we have? And what are we not allowed to do? But then, aside from political philosophy, autonomy also comes up in moral philosophy. So, to say that you have a responsibility to return the lost wallet to its rightful owner, to have the responsibility or the obligation to do that means first that you have the freedom to do that. Because if you didn't have the freedom to think for yourself and to render a decision, how could you be responsible for it? Now, in order to have the freedom of choice and therefore responsibility, someone like Kant says that you must first be rational. So a philosophical question that we're sort of laying out here is, what do you think comes before the other? Freedom or reason? Do I need to be rational in order to be free? Or do I need to be free in order to be rational? Kind of a chicken and the egg scenario. And you could probably argue some legitimacy in either direction. But here's what Kant says. Kant says that the kind of normative freedom that we really want, people may talk about freedom this and freedom that really loosely, but the freedom that's really desirable is a freedom that is conditioned by reason. In other words, when we have a rational agent who's thinking through a number of different options, who's properly informed by what's going on, and renders a decision for herself, that is the kind of free choice that as philosophers we want to see happen and that we value. Someone just arbitrarily picking something with no rhyme or reason, they may be free to do that, but that's not really the kind of normative freedom that we're going for. So the point from Kant is that only by having the capacity to be rational are the conditions for freedom met. Put more simply, we need to be rational thinkers before we can truly be free. And we need to have that kind of freedom before we have moral responsibility. In short, autonomy means thinking for yourself, making your own decisions. But before you express and manifest a decision in embodied action, you must first think of a decision in your mind. You have an internal autonomy of thought before you have an external autonomy of action. And so this is relevant to what we're talking about here is in the following way. People have different choices they want to make. They want to pursue their own idea of the good, whatever that might consist of and whatever might be required for it. But we're also living in a society in which we are in interdependent relationships with other people, and we've created this sovereign power that has this new authority to pass laws that govern us. And so those laws, which are, if we go with Rousseau's theory, the result of the general will, everybody voting, but that can disenfranchise, not disenfranchise, but make a minority of people do something that they don't want to do. That is the tension between political authority and individual autonomy. So, you know, in this section, he talks a lot about the reasons why someone would do something. You know, like someone might tell you to do something. They just happen to bring it up to you, like, oh, you should eat this apple. And it turns out you were going to eat that apple anyway because it's a Honeycrisp and you like sweeter apples rather than a Pink Lady, which is more like a tart apple. So that person told you to do something and you did it. But you actually didn't do it because he told you to do it. He doesn't have any power to make you do it, and he doesn't have any authority to tell you to do it. It just happened to be the occasion that he suggested it to you and you did do it. But the reason you did it is because you chose to do it out of your own preferences and tastes. So just because you do something that someone tells you to do doesn't mean you did it because they told you to do it. All right, so section 3, which begins on 18 of the first chapter, the conflict between authority and autonomy. He says this: the defining mark of the state is authority, the right to rule. The primary obligation of human beings is autonomy, the refusal to be ruled. It would seem then that there can be no resolution to the conflict between autonomy and the individual and the putative authority of the state. So, the way Wolff sees it, we have a sort of obligation to ourselves, a duty to ourselves. And different philosophers talk about duties to self, so it's nothing really new. It's kind of not maybe a little stronger than a duty, but we could call it an imperative, something that you really have to do. And the imperative is to think for yourself, to not let yourself be, let's say, colonized by the thought of other people when they tell you to do something. So we all grew up being, in a sense, colonized by our parents. They gave us a morality, they gave us a religion, they told us what to eat, they told us where to go to school, but then we emerged as autonomous individuals, somewhere in our teens probably. We think for ourselves and we render our own decisions. And so that's part of what philosophers say life is all about. Becoming an individual, thinking for yourself, standing on your own two intellectual feet. So we have an obligation to be individuals, we have an obligation to be autonomous, we have an obligation to think for ourselves and to do what we want to do what we decide to do, at least for ourselves. It's a different question about whether or not what we do affects other people. But insofar as it just affects us, we have obligations to walk this earth and live this life according to our own values and principles and so on and so forth. So, how can we do that if we have to live in a political context in which we live under the rule of law and some laws get passed that not only that we might have gotten the opportunity to vote on, but the results were not what we wanted, and nevertheless we are compelled to follow them. So how does this not hinder or obstruct or constrain our autonomy in a very fundamental, problematic way? Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 1. And as I said before, what we got there is the concept of authority, autonomy, and why there is a fundamental conflict between the two. Okay. The next section is the solution of classical democracy. So in this, the largest section of the book, Wolff is reviewing what other past, mainly modern Enlightenment, that is 17th, 18th, maybe 19th century political philosophers, how they talked about a democracy as the solution to this problem, the problem of the conflict between the authority and the state. And before we get into it, we can just sketch the overview, which is that he's going to review different positions. He's ultimately going to reject the arguments of other philosophers and say that democracy doesn't really do the trick, doesn't really get us to where we want. And what we want, as the book would entail us, and we haven't even defined anarchism yet, but what we want to be able to do ultimately from Wolff's perspective is to live in some kind of community, call it a state. I guess we should call it a state. Live in a political community and yet not have our autonomy fundamentally obstructed or hindered. So that's the problem. Can classical democracy solve that problem? He says no. So, what does classical democracy tell us? Well, lucky for us in our philosophy of law and justice class that we read Rousseau's, the 2 works from Rousseau that we did read, because Rousseau is his #1 kind of foil. Foil sometimes mean person that he argues against, but it's not like he hates Rousseau. He thinks Rousseau's got a lot of good ideas. He just doesn't think they totally work. So remember that Rousseau tells us that The social contract is what creates the legitimate political authority. And remember that when everybody leaves the state of nature and joins civil society, that everybody needs to consent to the social contract. Because the next section after this first section in chapter 2, the first section is democracy is the only feasible solution. The next section is unanimous direct democracy. Excuse me. Unanimous direct democracy, as we've talked about, means for every law that is passed, every citizen gets to vote on it. So it's the very opposite of representative democracy. The point I want to make now is that in terms of the initial decision to join civil society, Wolff talks about it, I guess Rousseau uses this language, but it's like, he calls it the first promise, or the initial promise. The decision was to leave the state of nature and join civil society, and to consent to being part of this social contract where you're going to agree to live under the rule of law. And Rousseau tells us that we would want to do that because the social contract, we understand it as having the capacity to allow us to be as free as before. Chapter 6 of Book 1 of the Social Contract for Rousseau. So that was a little convoluted. Let me clear up what I just said. The point I want to underscore is that everybody leaving the state of nature joins civil society. That first decision to join civil society, that has to be unanimous. If someone doesn't want to consent to the social contract, they can stay in the state of nature. But everybody that wants to be part of civil society has to consent to it. In other words, you can't coerce or force anybody from the state of nature into civil society. All right? And then down the line, Rousseau tells us that, so actually before I get there. So we've got the ideal of direct democracy, namely that we do not want any representatives, because as we got from Rousseau, when we have representatives, we alienate our sovereignty, and alienate means to separate, and if the goal in moving in the state of nature is to be as free as before, we wouldn't be as free as before if we're alienating our sovereignty to representatives. So that's why we need direct democracy from Rousseau's position, and Wolff thinks that's a very good reason to want direct democracy. But Wolff is not satisfied with merely direct democracy. He wants unanimous direct democracy, and that's really the underlying principle in anarchism, which I'll define in a second. Recall that despite the fact that Rousseau, for the initial decision from the state of nature to civil society, required unanimous direct democracy, and secondly, that once we form civil society, there's still direct democracy, and there's still direct democracy, so no representatives, second point. But number 3, Rousseau doesn't require that for every law that gets passed, it has to be unanimous, meaning there has to be total agreement. So if there's 100 people in the society, all 100 of them have to render the same decision for it to become a law. So Rousseau does not require that, but Wolff wants to require that. Because, why does Wolff want to require that? Because only with unanimous consent do we avoid the problem of someone being forced to do something that they don't want to do. Only unanimous direct democracy, unanimous consent, avoids the problem of people's autonomy being obstructed. So, you can imagine that, we've used the example in class about, let's say we're having an end of the semester pizza party. Doesn't look like that's going to happen because of what's going on. But if we did and we were trying to figure out what kind of pizza we should order and we have 30 people in the class, you can imagine that we would all have different tastes, different preferences, different ethics that inform our food, different religions or traditions that inform our food choice. So you can imagine that even with something like as simple as like what kind of pizza we should order, it would be hard to render a decision in which we all agreed. I mean, it would be hard if we were all eating the exact same pizza, like one pizza for everybody. It wouldn't be that hard to agree that if the 30 of us, we order 30 pizzas and everybody gets the pizza that they want. But even that might be problematic for other reasons. So, the thing he talks about is, he acknowledges that unanimous direct democracy is an extremely high bar. So how do you get people to all agree? He reviews a number of different positions. He said, well, you can imagine a society where everyone is of the exact same religion and the religion gives very specific values and morals. Maybe that wouldn't really apply to the pizza case unless the religion had rules about food. But in a case like that, where basically what informs everybody's decisions is basically the same kind of background social tradition, then it wouldn't be that hard to get unanimous consent. But in the kind of pluralistic society that we live in, that's not really available. The point here is that, yeah, unanimous direct democracy is an extremely high bar. But although a high bar, he thinks that it is actually, on top of 27, he says, first, it is a genuine solution to the problem of autonomy and authority. And he says this is actually rare, that it is a genuine solution. Whereas majority rule and representation, which he's about to go over, those are like sham solutions. Those aren't real solutions. The reason they're not real solutions, we'll go over them in a minute, but the headline is that they coerce people to do something that they don't want to do. That is not a solution to the problem of authority and autonomy. That's just a continuation of the problem. So the next section, section 3, he reviews representative democracy. And he says a lot here. The biggest problem is that representatives, how can they really represent their constituents? I mean, when congressmen and senators talk about the people in my district, da-da-da-da-da, they're typically talking about the people that actually voted for them or elected them. So if it's a Democratic, a liberal kind of politician living in California or New York or something like that, they would say, well, my constituents believe that humans are doing actions that put carbon in the atmosphere and that warm the climate, and there's climate change because of that. Probably there are people in their districts that... Okay, picking up where I left off, I was talking about why Wolff rejects a majority rule democracy and representative democracy as not being able to solve the conflict between political authority and individual autonomy. So I was saying that someone in a liberal district might say that their constituents believe X, Y, and Z about climate change, but there might be people within their constituency that actually don't. So when they say, my constituents want this, they're really talking about maybe a perceived want, or maybe they're only talking about some, maybe a majority, but maybe only, some of their constituents. So he talks about, for example, how is a representative really going to even be able to represent what every single individual in their constituency think? Certainly they're not going to go around and talk to everybody. How could they? So, of course, how could they? But what that shows is, if they're not discovering what their constituents want, they don't necessarily know what they want. If they don't know what their constituents want, how could they possibly be representatives of them? So the critique of representation is that, first of all, as Rousseau said, you alienate some of your autonomy away by giving it to the representatives. But B, that they can't actually adequately represent you because it's hardly even a possibility that they typically only represent a majority, and if not a majority, a plurality of people within their constituency overall. So representative democracy simply does not solve this problem of authority and autonomy. Majority rule doesn't solve it either, even though somebody like Rousseau advocated for majority rule and thought it's probably as best as we're going to be able to get. The reason why majority rule doesn't solve the problem is that even if the majority is, let's say the society is 100 people and 99 people vote for X and the one other person votes for Y, that's almost a unanimous direct democracy. Unanimous direct democracy. But even in cases where one person is left made to do something that they don't want to do, if there is even at least one case of that, then we really haven't solved the problem of political authority and autonomy. Just to take a step back, he talks about throughout this book a number of instances in which someone might have a good reason to vote a certain way or a good reason to accept something, basically out of practicality or utility, rather than recognizing that, for example, a representative has any real kind of legitimate authority. That's a little bit beside the point. So the point is that majority rule doesn't work and representation doesn't work. Did you enjoy on page 34 the first appendix in which he gives a suggestion about how direct democracy would work? So this book was written in 1998. So just as the internet was coming around, but he says on page 34 that he thinks that we could do in-home voting through machines connected to our TVs. It's almost like sort of proto-internet. Knowing what we know now about internet technology and hackers and how susceptible government systems, it probably doesn't sound quite as easy. He didn't really make it sound easy, but even if you could vote for home, would we be able to actually get people to get full political participation? It's hard. All right, so section 3, he goes over why he rejects majoritarian democracy. I just went over that. He talks about, like on page 50, why Rousseau favored it and what he liked about it. So, then he's got an appendix there for the... So, that almost brings us to the end, and it about does. So what he says is that this fundamental conflict between the authority of the state and individual autonomy, first of all, is a legitimate problem, is not resolved by democracy, either majority rule democracy, or representative democracy. And the only thing that actually solves this problem is unanimous direct democracy. And, the name of this book is In Defense of Anarchism, but I haven't even, exactly said what anarchism is. So, anarchism, first of all, to continue that last line of thought, anarchism does solve this problem. The problem, it solves it in theory at least, the problem of how to resolve this tension between collective political authority and individual autonomy. How does it resolve this problem? It resolves this problem by being based on a system of unanimous direct democracy. No one's autonomy is thwarted because the only laws that get passed are the laws that everybody consents to and everybody agrees to unanimously. So we have that unanimity, and we have that direct democracy. That makes the political authority legitimate, and it avoids the problem of people's autonomy being obstructed or unreasonably constrained. So this book is hardly really a book on anarchism. It's more the kind of first step toward the legitimacy of anarchism. There's lots of different types of anarchist theory that has various different emphases. So you have anarcho-syndicalism, which is represented by a famous intellectual like Noam Chomsky. Their main task is to destroy the system of wage labor. Not destroy notions of work, but destroy the idea of working for other people, creating wealth for other people, and not getting a share in that wealth. there's like green anarchism that kind of focuses on the environment. Some forms of libertarianism. There's a sort of like anarchist libertarianism. So lots of different kind of flavors and types of anarchism. And so he's not talking about any of that. This is just the most fundamental idea running through all anarchist theory is unanimous direct democracy. Why is that a good thing? Because it solves this problem that he's outlined. And how could it work? I mean, he hasn't necessarily given us a big book with various different contingencies about how everything could possibly work and how you would resolve conflict and et cetera, but he points us in a certain direction. So we're kind of wrapping things up here. So what this, the reason why we're reading this book and what we're doing in terms of the class is we got State of Nature and Social Contract Theory from Rousseau. Then we skipped to the 20th century with John Rawls and got A Theory of Justice. That's kind of like a continuation of Rousseau's thought. So if we were going to set up the society, how would we want that society governed by a notion of political justice? And how would we arrive at that notion of political justice? That's what the original position and Veil of Ignorance is all about. But then this book says, well, let's take a step back from that and ask why we would want any kind of democratic system that wasn't based on unanimous direct democracy, and how we could retain these principles of autonomy and legitimate political authority if we did not have unanimous direct democracy. So we could see then how Wolff is very much in conversation with Rousseau, and he doesn't really mention Rawls, but if he's in conversation with Rousseau, he's kind of in conversation with Rawls a little bit. Now, moving forward for next week, for our next text, we're going to be reading Murray Bookchin's Social Ecology and Communalism. Bookchin is another sort of radical thinker, whereas people like Rousseau and Rawls, they're good Enlightenment era. I mean, Rawls is 20th century, but they're very much of the modern Enlightenment era. But they're like reformists. How do we reform the system? Whereas radical philosophy is like, to hell with reforming it, let's tear it down and get a new system going. Anarchism, socialism, communism, something like that, and other options as well. So what we're going to get then, how this book is going to lead us into Bookchin's book, is as follows. Toward the end, I didn't even mention the third section, Beyond the Legitimate State, in which he, the second section of that was Utopian Glimpses of a World Without States. He actually doesn't really do much to actually describe what those glimpses are, but that's what Bookchin will do. Bookchin will connect the kind of anarchist philosophy that we're just getting the seeds of from this book to issues concerning the environment. That's the ecology. He's going to give us his version of it, social ecology, and communalism. And communalism is a sort of, I think it might be Bookchin's own term, but what he's envisioning is a bunch of kind of small-scale communities, a federation, not a United States, but United Federation of small-scale anarchist-type communities that have the environment as a fundamental concern. So that's what I just said, is basically how this book bridges Rousseau and then where we're going next with Bookchin, and then after that, even more environmental justice theory, first with, I forgot the guy's name because I haven't read his book yet, but the book on environmental justice, Schlossberg, something like that. And then finally to De Boer for the environmental sovereignty. Okay, so normally I'll have these videos up earlier than I did. This has been a crazy hectic week, so complete the discussions, respond to other people, stay safe, wash those hands, and I'll catch y'all on the flip side with the next video on social ecology. All right then.